November 7th, 1913. A child is born in a cramped apartment in Mondovi, Algeria, 3 months premature, so fragile the midwife doesn't think he'll survive the night. His father, Lucien Camus, a cellar worker in a vineyard, never holds him. 10 months later, shrapnel from German artillery tears through Lucien's skull at the First Battle of the Marne. The boy will grow up not knowing his father's voice, his laugh, or even what he truly looks like, beyond a single faded photograph. This child, born into poverty and silence, will become Albert Camus, one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. A man who transformed personal suffering into a philosophy that millions would embrace. But his beginning was marked by absence and deprivation so profound it would haunt everything he wrote. The apartment in the working-class Belcourt district of Algiers, where Albert's mother Catherine moved after his father's death, contained almost nothing. 2 rooms, no electricity, no running water, a shared toilet in the hallway used by multiple families. Catherine was partially deaf, nearly mute, illiterate. She cleaned houses for wealthy French colonists, scrubbing floors until her hands cracked and bled. She came home exhausted, sat by the window staring at nothing, and rarely spoke, not because she didn't want to, but because words seemed to have abandoned her after her husband's death. Albert shared this space with his older brother Lucien, his mother, his grandmother, and his uncle Etienne. His grandmother ruled the household with casual brutality. She beat the children with a whip made of ox sinew when they misbehaved, or sometimes just because she felt like it. Uncle Etienne was a barrel maker, silent and damaged, who'd returned from the war unable to speak about what he'd seen. The apartment was a place of silence and sudden violence, of hunger that gnawed constantly, of summer heat that made sleep impossible. School became Albert's sanctuary. His teacher, Louis Germain, recognized something in the skinny boy, with the intensity in his eyes. Germain stayed after class to tutor him, bought him books with his own money, and when Albert was 11, did something extraordinary. He went to the grandmother's apartment and convinced her to let Albert take the scholarship exam for the lycée, the elite secondary school. In a household where children were expected to start working as soon as possible to contribute money, this was revolutionary. Albert passed. He entered a world completely alien to everything he'd known. The lycée was where the sons of colonial administrators, military officers, and wealthy merchants studied. Albert wore patched clothes and shoes with holes. He spoke with the working-class accent of Belcourt. But he was brilliant, devouring literature and philosophy with an appetite that shocked his teachers. He discovered Gide, Malraux, and Dostoevsky. He read Nietzsche and felt something click into place, a recognition that the absence of inherent meaning wasn't despair but possibility. Then his body betrayed him. At 17, Albert began coughing blood. The diagnosis was tuberculosis, the disease that killed millions in the early 20th century, that had no cure, that meant isolation and often death. He was sent to recover at his uncle's house, in the hills above Algiers. For months he lay in bed, feeling his strength drain away, wondering if this was how his life would end before it had truly begun. Tuberculosis changed everything. It made him ineligible for the aggregation, the competitive exam that would have led to a university teaching career. It gave him an intimate relationship with death that most teenagers never experience. It made every moment feel borrowed, temporary, precious. Years later, he would write that tuberculosis taught him to live as if he might die tomorrow, but also to see beauty more intensely because of that proximity to death. He returned to Algiers transformed, not broken but hardened, clarified. He enrolled at the University of Algiers to study philosophy, working odd jobs to pay his way. He loaded trucks at the docks, worked in a meteorology office, sold auto parts. He married Simone Hier, a beautiful troubled woman addicted to morphine. The marriage was a disaster from the start. She was unfaithful repeatedly. He discovered her in bed with his doctor. They divorced after 2 years, leaving Albert bitter and disillusioned about romantic love. But during this period, something else was forming. He began writing seriously, not as a hobby, but as a calling. He joined a theatre troupe, acting and directing plays for working-class audiences in Algiers. The theatre became his second education, teaching him timing, dramatic structure, and how words sound when spoken aloud. Every sentence he later wrote would be tested against that standard. Does it work when read aloud? Can you feel its rhythm? In 1937, he published his first book, a collection of essays called The Wrong Side and the Right Side. It sold barely any copies. No one outside Algiers noticed. But it contained the seeds of everything that would follow: meditations on poverty, his mother's silence, the indifference of the universe, and the fierce beauty of the Algerian sun and sea. He was developing a voice, spare and precise, that refused easy consolations. He also joined the Communist Party, believing it offered the best hope for Algeria's poor. He worked as a journalist for a left-wing newspaper, writing exposés about the miserable conditions of the Kabul people in the mountains, about colonial exploitation, about injustice so normalized that most French colonists didn't even see it. But the Communist Party's rigid orthodoxy, its Moscow-dictated positions, its willingness to sacrifice truth for political expediency, disgusted him. He quit after 2 years, refusing ever again to submit his thinking to any ideology. By 1940, he'd moved to Paris, working as a layout editor for the newspaper Paris Soir. He was 26, unknown, struggling financially, separated from the North African sun that he loved, with an almost physical ache. And then Germany invaded France. The catastrophe he'd been watching approach for years had arrived. The government fled. Paris fell. The Third Reich's flag flew over the Eiffel Tower. Most of Paris Soir's staff evacuated to Bordeaux, then to Clermont-Ferrand in central France. Albert went with them, but the paper folded. He found himself stranded in Vichy France, the collaborationist puppet state, with no job, no money, and tuberculosis flaring up again. He retreated to a small village in the mountains, Le Panelier, where he lived in a boarding house and tried to write. This period of isolation and illness produced something remarkable. He drafted The Stranger, a novel about a French Algerian named Meursault who kills an Arab man on a beach and faces execution. Not really for the murder, but for his emotional indifference, for refusing to perform the expected feelings at his mother's funeral, for being honest about the meaninglessness he perceives in life. The novel's opening line would become one of the most famous in French literature. Mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I don't know. He also wrote The Myth of Sisyphus, a philosophical essay asking whether life's meaninglessness makes suicide the only logical choice. His answer was no. Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a mountain forever, only to watch it roll back down, becomes the hero of the absurd. He continues. He doesn't surrender. And in that continuation, in that rebellion against meaninglessness, he finds a kind of freedom. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, Camus wrote, a sentence that captures his entire philosophy in 5 words. These 2 works, written in isolation while the world was tearing itself apart, would make him famous. But first he had to survive the war. He returned to Algeria briefly in 1941, taught at a private school in Oran, and tried to regain his health. The tuberculosis wouldn't let him go. His lungs were damaged permanently. He would spend the rest of his life knowing that each breath was a small victory against the disease trying to kill him. In 1942, he received news that The Stranger would be published by Gallimard, France's most prestigious publishing house. It appeared in June 1942 during the German occupation, and despite the circumstances, it sold. People in occupied France read about Meursault's indifference and recognized something true about their own experience of a world that had stopped making sense. By the end of the year, Camus was being discussed in literary circles as a major new voice. The Myth of Sisyphus followed in October 1942. Together, the novel and the essay established Camus as the philosopher of the absurd, though he resisted that label, insisting he was a writer, not a philosopher. He was developing what he called absurdism, distinct from existentialism, though often confused with it. The absurd for Camus was the confrontation between human need for meaning and the universe's silence. We want answers. The universe provides none. That's the absurd. The question is how to live in full acknowledgement of that condition. But France was occupied. Publishing books was one thing. Surviving and resisting fascism was another. Camus joined the resistance, the underground network fighting German occupation. His role wasn't armed combat. His weapon was words. He became an editor and writer for Combat, a clandestine newspaper that circulated secretly, risking death for everyone involved. Being caught with a copy meant arrest, torture, deportation to camps. Writing and printing it meant even worse. The work was dangerous in ways that are hard to grasp now. Every issue of Combat was produced in hiding, printed on secret presses, distributed hand to hand in the shadows. The Gestapo was hunting for the people behind it. Several of Camus' colleagues were arrested, tortured, and executed. He used false papers, moved constantly, never slept in the same place twice. The risk was absolute. Discovery meant death not eventually, but quickly. During this period, Camus wrote some of his most powerful journalism. He argued for a resistance rooted not in hatred of Germans, but in love of freedom. He insisted that means matter as much as ends, that you cannot fight fascism by becoming fascists yourselves. This position was controversial. Some resistors believed total war justified any method. Camus refused that logic. Morality didn't get suspended during emergencies. That's when it mattered most. He also met Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher who was already famous. They became close friends, intellectual allies, spending long nights in cafes debating philosophy and politics. Sartre was developing existentialism, the idea that existence precedes essence, that we create our own meaning through choice. Camus' absurdism was similar, but crucially different. Sartre believed we could create meaning. Camus believed meaning was impossible, but that we should live fully and rebelliously anyway. The distinction seemed minor then. It would destroy their friendship later. Paris was liberated in August 1944. Camus was there, writing for Combat, which emerged from the underground to become a legal daily newspaper. His editorials during the liberation period were passionate, calling for justice but warning against revenge, demanding accountability for collaborators but opposing the death penalty. France was in chaos, settling scores, executing accused collaborators in the streets. Camus argued for trials, for due process, for not becoming murderers in the name of justice. The war ended. Camus was 31 years old, famous, respected, the voice of moral clarity in a world that had nearly destroyed itself. Combat had a circulation of 300,000. His books were bestsellers. He was invited to speak, to write, to opine on every major question facing post-war France. He had escaped poverty, disease, obscurity, and war. Everything he'd fought for had arrived. But fame brought its own complications. He was being pulled in directions he didn't want to go. Political factions tried to claim him. The Communist Party, which he'd rejected years earlier, attacked him as a bourgeois individualist. Right-wing intellectuals praised him for criticizing communism, missing that he criticized their nationalism just as fiercely. Everyone wanted to fit him into existing categories. He refused them all, and something else was forming, a new project that would take years to complete. He'd written about the absurd, about recognizing life's meaninglessness and continuing anyway. But what came next? If you accept the absurd, how do you act? How do you treat other people? What principles guide you when there are no absolute truths? The answer would become The Rebel, a book about revolution, violence, and the limits of rebellion. But that was still years away. For now, in 1945, as Europe counted its dead and tried to rebuild from the ashes, Albert Camus stood at a crossroads. He'd survived poverty, tuberculosis, and fascism. He'd created a philosophy for living without God or inherent meaning. He was famous, influential, and only 31 years old. The success terrified him. Camus had spent his entire life on the margins, scraping by, unknown outside Algeria. Now Paris wanted to turn him into something he'd never asked to be: a spokesman, a leader, a moral authority for an entire generation, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He hated it. The invitations piled up. Speak at the Sorbonne, lecture in Brussels, tour America. Publishers wanted more essays, more novels, more of whatever had made The Stranger resonate with a traumatized continent. Journalists showed up at his apartment unannounced. Strangers recognized him in cafes and wanted to discuss philosophy over his coffee. He couldn't walk through Saint-Germain-des-Prés without being stopped. This wasn't what he'd imagined when he was coughing blood in Algiers, writing in rented rooms, wondering if he'd live to see 30. Fame was supposed to mean freedom. Instead, it felt like a new kind of prison. He tried to keep working at Combat. The newspaper represented something pure to him, born in resistance, committed to truth without ideology. But the pressures were crushing. Every editorial became a battleground. The political left attacked him for criticizing the Soviet Union. The right attacked him for defending workers and opposing capitalism. He wanted the paper to remain independent, beholden to no party, but independence in post-war France was nearly impossible. By 1947, he resigned from Combat. The decision was agonizing, like abandoning a child, but the newspaper's direction was being pulled away from what he'd envisioned. It needed to survive financially, which meant compromises, which meant betraying the principles that had justified its existence. He returned to what he knew: writing, not journalism, but literature, philosophy disguised as stories. The Plague was published in June 1947, and it changed everything again. The novel tells the story of a plague outbreak in Oran, a coastal city in Algeria. The disease appears suddenly, rats dying in the streets, then humans. The authorities deny it, minimize it, refuse to acknowledge what's happening until denial becomes impossible. The city is sealed, no one can leave. Everyone trapped inside must decide how to respond. Some panic, some profiteer, some retreat into private pleasures, ignoring the dying around them. But a small group, led by Dr. Rieu, the narrator, chooses to fight. Not because they believe they'll win, not because fighting has cosmic significance, but because people are suffering and doing nothing is unacceptable. Rieu is not a hero in the traditional sense. He's exhausted, often despairing, watching friends die despite his efforts. He doesn't believe in God. He has no grand theory about why this is happening. He just keeps working, treating patients, organising volunteers, documenting what occurs. The plague, of course, was the Nazi occupation. Everyone understood this immediately. The disease spreading through Oran was fascism spreading through Europe. The sealed city was France under German control. The characters represent different responses to totalitarianism: resistance, collaboration, indifference, opportunism. But Camus had done something subtle. He never mentioned Nazis, never mentioned occupation. The novel could be read as a literal story about disease. This made it universal. The plague could be any evil, any catastrophe that forces ordinary people to choose between their comfort and their humanity. Critics loved it. Readers loved it. The Plague sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Camus, already famous, became unavoidable. He was 33 years old and being discussed in the same breath as Sartre, as Gide, as the giants of French literature. And he was miserable. The tuberculosis had returned. His lungs, scarred from childhood, couldn't handle the stress, the cigarettes, the late nights arguing in smoky cafes. He coughed constantly, slept poorly, woke exhausted. Doctors ordered rest, mountain air, sanatoriums. He ignored them as long as possible, then finally, reluctantly, left Paris for treatment. His marriage was disintegrating. Francine, his wife, had followed him to Paris after the war. She'd given birth to twins in 1945, a son and daughter. Camus loved his children desperately, but fatherhood didn't domesticate him. He continued affairs, multiple relationships overlapping, women drawn to the famous, tortured writer who spoke about absurdity and rebellion. Francine knew, everyone knew. Paris literary circles were small. Gossip travelled fast. She endured it for years, trying to hold the family together, raising the twins largely alone, while Camus travelled, wrote, disappeared into his work and his other lives. The guilt ate at him. He believed in honesty, in living authentically, but he was lying constantly. To Francine, to his lovers, to himself. He couldn't reconcile what he wrote about, integrity and moral clarity, with how he actually lived. So he wrote about that too. The Fall, published years later, would be his most personal novel, a confession disguised as fiction. The story of a successful Parisian lawyer who realizes his entire life is a performance, that beneath his moral posturing lies vanity and cowardice. The protagonist, Jean-Baptiste Clamence, delivers a long monologue, confessing his sins, implicating the reader in the same hypocrisies. But that was still ahead. In the late 40s, Camus was caught between the image the world had of him and the reality he couldn't escape. His friendship with Sartre was fracturing. They'd been close during the war, united against fascism, philosophical allies exploring similar questions about freedom and meaning. But peace revealed their differences. Sartre was moving left, aligning with communism, arguing that violence was justified in revolutionary struggles. Camus was moving nowhere, or perhaps backward, insisting that violence was never fully justified. That means couldn't be separated from ends. The arguments started small. Disagreements over reviews, over political positions, over how to respond to Soviet repression. Stalin's regime was revealing its brutality, the gulags, the purges, the totalitarian machinery grinding up millions. Sartre excused it or minimized it, arguing that communist goals justified temporary atrocities. Camus found this obscene. How was Soviet totalitarianism different from Nazi totalitarianism? Both murdered in the name of ideology. Both treated human beings as material for grand historical projects. Both demanded total obedience and crushed dissent. Sartre and the intellectual left accused Camus of moral equivalence, of being blind to the difference between fascism and communism, between reactionary violence and revolutionary violence. Camus accused them of betraying everything they claimed to believe, of excusing murder when their side committed it. The debate wasn't abstract. It consumed French intellectual life. Writers, philosophers, artists were forced to choose sides. The Cold War was beginning, the world splitting into American and Soviet spheres, and neutrality seemed impossible. Camus refused to choose. He criticized both, American capitalism and imperialism, Soviet tyranny and repression. He was called naive, utopian, politically useless. Neither side wanted nuance, both wanted unconditional support. He kept writing, kept thinking, kept trying to articulate a position that honoured human dignity without illusions about creating paradise. The result was The Rebel, published in 1951. The book that would destroy his friendship with Sartre and cement his isolation from the French intellectual establishment. The Rebel is a philosophical essay about revolution and its limits. Camus traces the history of rebellion from ancient times through the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the rise of totalitarianism. He argues that rebellion begins with a recognition of injustice, a refusal to accept oppression. This is noble. This is necessary. But rebellion, he warns, contains a fatal temptation. The temptation to pursue absolute justice, to create a perfect society, to remake humanity itself. This leads inevitably to mass murder. Because humans are imperfect, because they resist utopian schemes, they must be eliminated or re-educated or forced into compliance. Every revolution that aimed at total transformation, Camus argued, ended in tyranny. The French Revolution's terror, Soviet gulags, Nazi death camps, all began with noble ideals, all ended drowning in blood. The alternative he proposed was modest rebellion. Fight injustice, yes. Resist oppression, absolutely. But reject grand ideologies that promise to solve everything. Reject leaders who demand you sacrifice today's human beings for tomorrow's paradise. Accept limits. Accept uncertainty. Accept that we're all absurd creatures trying to create meaning in a meaningless universe, and that solidarity, not ideology, is the only honest response. The French left exploded. Sartre's journal, Les Temps Modernes, published a savage review. The reviewer, Francis Janson, accused Camus of abandoning the oppressed, of preferring comfortable philosophy to necessary action, of being irrelevant to the real struggles of workers and colonized peoples. Sartre, in his own essay, twisted the knife deeper. He suggested Camus had lost his courage, that fame had softened him, that he was no longer capable of the commitment real political engagement required. Camus responded angrily, personally, attacking Sartre's coziness with Stalinism, his willingness to excuse atrocities. The letters were published, the friendship ended, they never spoke again. The break wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. Camus found himself increasingly isolated, attacked from the left as a reactionary, attacked from the right as too soft on communism, belonging nowhere. He retreated, back to literature, back to theatre. He adapted and directed plays, losing himself in production work, in rehearsals, in the physical labour of stagecraft. Theatre had always been his first love, back in Algiers with his friends, creating something from nothing. And he thought about Algeria. France's colonial war was escalating. The Algerian independence movement, suppressed for years, was gaining strength. Violence was increasing, bombings, assassinations, French reprisals. The country where he'd been born, where his mother still lived, was tearing itself apart. Camus' position was agonizingly complicated. He opposed colonialism, had written against it for years. He believed Algeria deserved justice, that French rule had been exploitative and brutal, but he also feared what independence might bring: civil war, ethnic cleansing, the slaughter of the European population, including his family. He tried to advocate for a middle path, a federated Algeria where Europeans and Arabs could coexist, reforms instead of revolution, negotiation instead of violence. Both sides rejected this. The French right called him a traitor. The Algerian nationalists called him a colonialist apologist. His nuance, his refusal to embrace absolute positions, made him useless to everyone. In 1956, he travelled to Algiers to appeal for a civilian truce, begging both sides to stop targeting innocent people. A group of European extremists, furious at his presence, tried to storm the building where he was speaking. He barely escaped. He stopped writing about Algeria after that. The silence was interpreted as cowardice by some, wisdom by others. Really? It was despair. He had no answers. The violence he'd warned about in The Rebel, the cycle of oppression breeding resistance, breeding more violence, was playing out in front of him, and he was powerless to stop it. His health continued deteriorating. The tuberculosis was chronic now, a permanent companion. He couldn't work long hours, couldn't smoke, though he did anyway, couldn't drink, though he did that too. The body he'd never quite trusted was giving out. He bought a house in Lourmarin, a small village in Provence. Quiet, away from Paris, from the arguments, from the demands. He wanted to write, just write, without the weight of being Albert Camus, public intellectual, moral conscience, all the roles he'd never sought. He was working on a new novel, his most ambitious, The First Man, an autobiographical work about his childhood in Algeria, about poverty and education, and becoming himself. It was tender in a way his other work wasn't, personal, vulnerable. He was 46 years old, still young despite feeling ancient, still capable of great work. The isolation was painful, but maybe necessary. Maybe he'd needed to lose the crowd's approval to write honestly again. January 4th, 1960. Michel Gallimard was driving his Farkle Vega sports car through the French countryside, heading back to Paris after the holiday. In the passenger seat sat Albert Camus. They were making good time on the Route Nationale 5. The road wet from recent rain, but manageable. The car was fast, expensive, a status symbol Gallimard loved. Camus had almost taken the train. He'd told friends he couldn't imagine a more absurd death than a car accident. His unused train ticket was in his coat pocket. Around 2 in the afternoon, near the village of Villeblevin, something happened. The car left the road at high speed. It struck one tree, then another. The impact was catastrophic. The vehicle disintegrated around them. Camus died instantly. Massive head trauma. His body was thrown from the wreckage. Gallimard survived initially, died in the hospital days later. Camus' briefcase was found in the wreckage containing the unfinished manuscript of The First Man, 144 handwritten pages, his life's most personal work, abandoned mid-sentence. He was 46 years old, at the height of his powers, finally free from the political battles, finally working on something that mattered to him purely. Cut down on a wet road in central France for no reason at all. The absurdity he'd spent his career describing had claimed him. There was no meaning to extract, no lesson, just waste. France mourned. Sartre, despite their estrangement, wrote a tribute, called him perhaps the last good man, acknowledged what he'd meant, what they'd lost. The funeral in Lourmarin was small, quiet. His widow, his children, a handful of friends. The famous writer buried in a village cemetery, far from Paris, far from Algeria, far from everything. But here's what's strange about literary deaths. They change everything that came before. Camus' work, which had seemed unfinished, inconclusive, suddenly appeared complete. A body of thought about how to live in a meaningless world, ended by the very meaninglessness it described. Critics who dismissed him began reconsidering. Maybe his refusal of systems, his insistence on limits, his stubborn humanism had been wisdom, not weakness. The First Man was published posthumously in 1994, 34 years after his death. Unfinished, rough, but extraordinary. It revealed dimensions of Camus people hadn't seen. The vulnerability beneath the austere philosophy, the love for his illiterate mother, the shame and pride of poverty. It was the book that might have redeemed him in his own eyes, proved he was more than a moralist, that he could write about tenderness without embarrassment. The Algeria he'd agonized over descended into exactly the nightmare he'd feared. The war for independence became vicious. The French used torture systematically. The FLN killed collaborators and European civilians. When independence finally came in 1962, hundreds of thousands of European settlers fled. Camus' vision of coexistence was abandoned by history. His silence in his final years looked less like cowardice and more like tragic prescience. He'd seen what was coming and had no words adequate to stop it. His philosophy, though, refused to die. The next generation discovered him differently, not as a Cold War intellectual, but as something stranger. A writer who'd taken seriously the hardest question: if nothing means anything, why not just end it? And who'd answered, because the sun still feels good, because there's wine and friendship, because rebellion against meaninglessness is itself meaningful. It wasn't systematic. It couldn't be defended in academic journals, but it worked as a way to live. The 1960s counterculture found him. Young people rejecting traditional values, rejecting their parents' certainties, found in Camus someone who'd rejected certainty first. The stranger became a Bible for outsiders. Meursault's refusal to perform the expected emotions, his honesty about feeling nothing, resonated with kids who'd been told how to feel their entire lives. Camus was teaching them permission to admit absurdity, to reject false comfort, to live anyway. Existentialism as a movement fractured and dissolved, but Camus endured separately. Sartre's dense philosophical treatises became period pieces. Camus' novels stayed alive. Teenagers still read The Stranger in high school and have their minds broken open. The prose, so simple it seems easy, reveals layers on rereading. The sun on the beach, the murder, the trial. It all functions as parable while remaining concrete, specific, real. His essays aged better than anyone expected. The myth of Sisyphus is still the clearest introduction to existential thought most people will encounter. The image of the man pushing the boulder uphill forever, condemned to meaningless labour, and choosing to imagine Sisyphus happy, that penetrates in a way academic philosophy doesn't. You can explain Camus to someone in a bar. Try that with Heidegger. The rebel remained controversial. The left never forgave it. Marxist critics still dismiss Camus as a liberal who couldn't stomach revolution's necessities. But then came the collapse of the Soviet Union, the revelations about the gulags, the acknowledgement of how many millions died for the glorious future. Suddenly Camus' warnings looked prophetic. His insistence that ends don't justify means, that revolution betrays itself when it murders in freedom's name. That stopped sounding naive. Historical vindication is cold comfort when you're dead, but he got it anyway. The personal life remained messy in retrospect. Multiple affairs, the difficulty of his marriage, the way he used his fame and charm, none of it looked good. Feminist critics pointed out the obvious. His philosophy of freedom applied conveniently to his own desires, less so to the women in his life. He was a man of his time, which is both explanation and indictment. The complexity doesn't erase the work, but it complicates the mythology. He wasn't a saint. Saints don't write interesting books. What he gave us was a vocabulary. Before Camus, you couldn't quite name certain feelings. The sense of being a stranger in your own life. The recognition that the world doesn't care about you, not from malice, but from simple indifference. The realization that you have to create meaning because none is provided. These were old human experiences, but he gave them shape, made them speakable. His influence spread in unexpected directions. The noir writers, the hard-boiled detectives walking mean streets without illusions. That's Meursault's descendants, the anti-heroes of 1970s cinema, refusing to be heroes, just surviving. They learned from Camus. Musicians from The Cure to Nick Cave absorbed his aesthetic of beautiful despair. The notion that art should confront darkness without flinching, without offering false hope, but also without surrendering to nihilism. That's his legacy. Philosophy departments still argue about whether he was really a philosopher. He had no systematic method, no grand theory. He told stories, wrote essays, circled around questions without definitively answering them. Some academics dismiss this as shallow. Others recognize it as a different kind of rigor. The rigor of honesty, of refusing to pretend you know more than you do. Socrates would have approved. The Mediterranean sensibility he championed. The embrace of physical pleasure and beauty, even while acknowledging death and meaninglessness, became countercultural wisdom. Against the northern gloom of German philosophy, against Christian denial of the flesh, against communist sacrifice of the present for the future, Camus said, "The body matters, sunlight matters, this moment matters." Not as distraction from truth, but as truth itself. Algeria haunted his legacy. When the country memorialized its independence struggle, Camus was erased. A French colonial writer, however sympathetic, had no place in the national mythology. His childhood home in Mondovi became a museum decades later, a tentative acknowledgement, but the relationship remained fraught. He'd loved a country that didn't want him, had tried to bridge a divide that history refused to bridge. That failure defined him as much as any success. The plague, weirdly, became his most relevant work in the 21st century. When COVID-19 hit, everyone rediscovered Dr. Rieu, the protagonist who fights epidemic, not for glory or hope of victory, but because fighting is what decency requires. The novel surged up bestseller lists. People trapped in lockdown found in Camus' fictional quarantined city a mirror for their experience. His insistence that we must act ethically, even when action seems futile, that resonated in a moment of collective helplessness. The political appropriation continued from all sides. Liberals claimed him for his anti-totalitarianism. Conservatives claimed him for his anti-communism. The left tried to reclaim him by emphasizing his early socialist commitments. Everyone wanted Camus on their team, which probably means he belonged to none of them. His actual position, skeptical of all systems, committed to reducing suffering without grand plans, fit no modern political category. Maybe that was the point. His writing style influenced generations of novelists. That clean, declarative prose, short sentences carrying enormous weight. The refusal of ornament. American minimalists like Raymond Carver and Joan Didion learned from it. The spare beauty, the way simplicity can devastate. You can trace a line from Camus' prose through decades of fiction that trusts readers to feel without being told what to feel. The Nobel Prize, which seemed premature in 1957, looked prescient after his death. The Swedish Academy had recognized something. This was a writer who mattered beyond literature, who changed how people thought about living. The youngest laureate in decades became the laureate whose work lasted. Not all Nobel winners age well. His did. Students still write theses about the contradictions in his thought. The tension between his philosophy of absurdism, which suggests nothing matters, and his ethics, which insists everything matters. Critics point out he never resolved this. But maybe it's not a contradiction. Maybe it's the human condition, described accurately. We live as if meaning exists because we have no choice, even while knowing meaning is something we create, not discover. That's not a flaw in Camus' logic. That's the truth he was trying to articulate. His letters, published posthumously, revealed a more anxious, uncertain person than the public intellectual. He doubted himself constantly. Worried his work wasn't good enough. Feared he'd lose his talent. The confident voice in the essays was achieved, constructed, a performance of certainty he didn't always feel, which makes the work more impressive, not less. He wrote his way to clarity, didn't start from it. The house in Lourmarin became a pilgrimage site. Fans visit his grave, leave flowers, take photos. The village tolerates it with the resigned patience of places made famous by tragedy. The locals remember him as a neighbour who wanted quiet, not as the symbol he became. That gap between the man and the mythology, no one bridges it. We get the legend, the work, the ideas. The actual person is lost, like everyone who dies. His widow, Francine, outlived him by 19 years, raised their children, protected his legacy, maintained dignity through decades of posthumous revelations about his affairs. She never remarried. Whether from love, loyalty, or simply exhaustion, we'll never know. The spouses of famous people rarely get fair treatment from history. She was more than Camus' wife, but that's primarily how she's remembered. The children carried complicated inheritances. To be the son or daughter of Albert Camus, what does that mean? Impossible expectations, permanent comparisons, the weight of a father frozen at 46, never aging, never failing again. They lived private lives deliberately, refusing interviews, staying out of spotlight. Smart choice. They knew the mythology would consume them if they let it. What remains is the work. 6 novels, multiple essay collections, plays, journalism, a body of thought about how to live without God, without certainty, without hope of cosmic justice. And his answer, stripped down: live anyway, rebel against meaninglessness through the act of living fully. Love what's beautiful, fight what's cruel, accept that you'll fail, do it anyway. Not because success is guaranteed, because the alternative is surrender. The summer of 1959, months before the crash, Camus started keeping notes for a new novel. He called it The First Man. Autobiographical, raw, different from anything he'd written. A return to Algeria, to childhood, to the poverty and sun and silence of his early years. He'd spent 2 decades building arguments, constructing philosophies, speaking to intellectuals. Now he wanted to write about his mother, who couldn't read, his neighbourhood, where nobody discussed Nietzsche, the ordinary grace of people who lived without examining whether life had meaning. The manuscript was in the car, crumpled, muddy, blood-stained, when they pulled it from the wreckage. His daughter Catherine kept it for 30 years before allowing publication. When it finally appeared in 1994, readers discovered something unexpected: tenderness. The essays were brilliant but often cold, controlled, architectural. This was different. Unfinished sentences, fragments, rushes of feeling barely contained by syntax. The voice of someone trying to say what he'd never said before. Critics debated whether it would have been his masterpiece or his failure. Impossible question. We have the scaffolding, not the building, but the scaffolding reveals intention. He was moving somewhere new, away from philosophy disguised as fiction, towards something more direct: memory, gratitude, an attempt to honour the people who shaped him before he became someone who won prizes. There's a passage where he describes his mother's silence. Not philosophical silence, just the quiet of a woman too tired and deaf to talk much. He writes about sitting with her, both of them watching the street. Nothing happening, everything happening. That's the moment. Not Sisyphus pushing the boulder, just the son and his mother together, time passing. He was 56 pages in when he died. Algeria haunted the unfinished book because Algeria haunted him until the end. The war escalated through the late 50s. Bombings in Algiers, massacres in villages, French paratroopers torturing suspects, FLN fighters executing collaborators. Everyone choosing sides, demanding everyone else choose sides. Camus refused the binary. Got accused of cowardice by people who thought neutrality was betrayal. His position was complicated, maybe indefensible, definitely unpopular. He opposed French colonialism, supported Algerian self-determination in theory, but feared independence would mean the expulsion or murder of the European settlers, including his own family. He wanted a federated solution, French and Arabs sharing power, nobody displaced, practically impossible, politically naive, morally understandable if you had a mother still living in Algiers who'd be in danger either way. Sartre broke with him over this. Their friendship, already strained after the rebel controversy, shattered completely. Sartre supported the FLN unconditionally, argued that violence by the oppressed was justified, dismissed concerns about European civilians as colonial hand-wringing. Camus called this intellectual terrorism, philosophy written from the safety of Paris cafes, while actual people died. Sartre called him a colonialist apologist hiding behind humanism. Both were partly right, both partly wrong. That's what made it tragic. Sartre was correct that colonialism was an atrocity requiring dismantling by any means necessary. Camus was correct that revolutionary violence devours innocence, and intellectuals romanticizing it from a distance are morally unserious. Neither could acknowledge the other's point without undermining their own position. So they stopped speaking. The silence hurt Camus more. He'd looked up to Sartre, considered him a mentor, needed his approval in ways he never admitted publicly. When Sartre's journal L'Instant Moderne published a vicious review of The Rebel, essentially calling Camus a philosophical lightweight, Camus wrote a wounded, defensive response. Sartre replied with contempt. Their exchange, printed in the journal, was painful to read. Brilliant minds reduced to personal attacks. Two men who'd survived the resistance together, now treating each other as enemies. Paris intellectual life took sides. Most chose Sartre. He was the giant, the systematic thinker, the one who'd built an entire philosophical edifice. Camus was the elegant stylist, the moralist, the one who wrote beautifully, but maybe didn't think deeply enough. That was the narrative. It stuck for decades. Only later did scholars realize Camus' philosophy, less systematic but more humane, might have been the more durable contribution. He withdrew from a public life after the Nobel. Not completely, but noticeably. Fewer essays, fewer speeches, fewer appearances at events where everyone wanted his opinion. He bought the house in Lourmarin partly to escape Paris, the arguments, the pressure to have positions on everything. He wanted to write, spend time with his children, live quietly. Fame had given him everything he'd wanted as a poor kid in Algeria. Money, respect, influence. Now it felt like a trap. His health declined. Tuberculosis never left him, just went dormant. The 1959 flare-up was serious enough that doctors ordered complete rest. He spent weeks in bed, reading, making notes, thinking about mortality in concrete rather than philosophical terms. He was 46. His father had died at 29 in World War I. He'd already outlived him by 17 years, but 46 still felt young. Too young to worry about whether you'd finish your work. The affair with Mie was ending badly. She wanted commitment, wanted him to leave his wife, wanted the relationship to be central instead of compartmentalized. He couldn't or wouldn't do it. The letters between them, published decades later, show two people wanting incompatible things, neither willing to compromise, both causing the other pain. She accused him of cowardice. He accused her of demanding what he'd never promised. Classic affair dynamics, made more intense by his fame, her ambition, the impossibility of privacy. Francine knew. Wives usually do. She tolerated his previous affairs with the exhausted patience of someone who'd made a decision early on about what she could live with. But this one lasted longer, went deeper, threatened the arrangement. They fought. He moved out briefly, moved back, moved out again. The marriage was intact legally, but hollowed out emotionally. They were parents more than spouses by 1959. His children, Catherine and Jean, were teenagers, old enough to sense the tensions, young enough to not fully understand them. He tried to be present, took them on trips, wrote them letters when travelling, but his attention was divided, his energy depleted by work, affairs, politics, illness. The gap between the father he wanted to be and the father he was managing to be. That's another thing that haunted him. December 1959 felt like transition. The decade ending, a new one starting, everything uncertain. Algeria was tearing itself apart. His marriage was failing. His health was fragile. His career was at a strange pause, the Nobel behind him. The next phase undefined. He talked about writing a new play, maybe directing again. He talked about finishing The First Man, making it the book that explained everything. He talked about travelling less, settling into Lourmarin, finding peace. Then Michel Gallimard called, his publisher, his friend. Driving back to Paris after New Year's, plenty of room in the car, why take the train? Camus had already bought a train ticket. He preferred trains, liked the rhythm, the time to read and think. But Gallimard insisted, and it seemed easier to agree than explain why he'd rather sit alone in a rail compartment watching the countryside pass. That decision, that tiny, meaningless decision. Say no, take the train, live. Everything that didn't happen sprawls out from that moment. The books he didn't write, the plays he didn't direct. The reconciliation with Sartre that might have come eventually. The grandchildren he never met. The chance to see Algeria independent and know whether his fears were justified or his hopes possible. All of it erased by saying yes instead of no. The Farchel Vega was fast, prestigious, dangerous. Rear-engine design made it unstable at high speeds. Gallimard liked driving fast. Route Nationale 5 was straight, empty, tempting. Exactly the kind of road where speed feels safe until it isn't. Witnesses said the car was travelling over 90 miles per hour when it drifted slightly, overcorrected, spun, hit a tree. Physics did the rest. Gallimard died 6 days later in the hospital, never regaining consciousness. His wife and daughter survived with injuries. Camus died instantly, they said. Though who knows what instantly means, whether there's a flash of recognition or just sudden nothing. The unused train ticket was in his pocket. That detail haunted everyone who heard it. The randomness, the waste. Sartre wrote the obituary for Les Temps Modernes. After years of silence, of bitterness, of mutual contempt, he wrote about Camus with grief and admiration, called him the present heir of that long line of French moralists, whose works constitute perhaps the most original element in French letters. Admitted they'd been friends, fought, couldn't reconcile, but never stopped respecting each other. The essay was generous, painful, too late. That's the cruelty. People say what they actually feel after someone dies when it can't repair anything. Sartre spent 7 years treating Camus as an intellectual lightweight, then wrote beautifully about his importance once he was gone. The praise Camus had needed in 1952, when the rebel was savaged and their friendship shattered, finally came in 1960 when he couldn't hear it. France mourned. Even people who'd criticised him recognised the loss. He wasn't just a writer, but a moral voice, someone who'd articulated how to live in a world without transcendent meaning. The generation that survived the war, that lived through occupation and collaboration and liberation, that had to rebuild not just cities but the idea of what it meant to be human. They'd looked to him for answers. Now he was gone, and the questions remained. Algeria achieved independence in 1962, 2 years after his death. The war he couldn't solve, the dilemma that broke his friendship with Sartre, the situation he called for moderation in, it ended in exactly the violence he'd feared. Nearly 1 million European settlers fled to France. Tens of thousands of Algerians who'd worked with the French were murdered as traitors. The FLN won, but the country descended into decades of authoritarian rule and civil conflict. Nobody's predictions were vindicated. Everyone's fears were partly confirmed. His mother outlived him. Deaf, silent Catherine Camus, who couldn't read her son's books, who lived simply in Algiers until the Europeans had to leave, then moved to France, confused and displaced. She died in 1960, the same year, months after him. Maybe that's mercy. She never had to fully comprehend what happened, never had to articulate grief she lacked words for anyway. The absurd became his permanent label. Camus, philosopher of the absurd, as if that summed him up. It doesn't. The absurd was his starting point, not his conclusion. Yes, life has no inherent meaning. Yes, we're going to die and be forgotten, and nothing we do matters cosmically. He spent 2 pages establishing that. Then he spent the rest of his career asking, so what do we do now? His answer kept evolving. The myth of Sisyphus said, imagine him happy. Find meaning in the struggle itself. The plague said, fight suffering even though you'll lose. Solidarity is its own justification. The rebel said, revolt against injustice without becoming unjust limits matter. The first man, unfinished, was reaching towards something else. Gratitude, maybe. Memory. The idea that meaning comes from loving the world despite its indifference. He never finished the argument. We got the opening chapters, not the conclusion, which is frustrating and somehow appropriate. A philosophy of living fully, cut short. A meditation on mortality, ended by death. the universe's sense of humour, if the universe cared enough to have one. His books didn't disappear. That's the first thing that happened after he died. People started reading them differently, seriously, without the noise of his living presence complicating reception. The Stranger sold more copies in the decade after 1960 than it had in the previous 17 years. Students discovered it, passed it around, found in Meursault's blank honesty something that spoke to their own alienation. The opening lines became iconic. "Mother died today," or maybe yesterday, I don't know. That flatness, that refusal of sentiment, it captured something about post-war consciousness that conventional literature couldn't touch. The Plague became a classroom staple. Teachers loved it because you could read it multiple ways simultaneously. Literal story about disease, allegory for Nazi occupation, meditation on how communities respond to crisis, exploration of different philosophical positions through the characters. Dr. Rieu's quiet heroism, Tarot's search for sainthood without God, Rambert's initial selfishness giving way to solidarity, Father Panelou's faith collapsing, then reconstructing itself, each represented an option, a way of being. Camus wasn't preaching, he was mapping the terrain. The Nobel Prize speech got anthologized. That passage about the writer's duty, about refusing to lie, about serving those who suffer history rather than those who make it. Students in the 60s read it as justification for their protests, their refusal to accept authorities' narratives. He'd been dead less than a decade, and already he was being claimed by movements he never joined, causes he might not have endorsed. The left quoted him against war. The right quoted him against communism. Everyone found the Camus they needed. Algeria haunted his reception for years. French intellectuals who'd supported independence didn't forgive his silence, his moderation, his refusal to choose sides cleanly. They saw cowardice where he'd seen complexity. Sartre's camp kept winning the argument by default. History seemed to prove them right, since Algeria got independence and the world didn't end. But then came the purges, the revenge killings, the authoritarianism, and suddenly Camus's warnings about revolutionary violence looked less naive, not vindicated exactly, but worth reconsidering. The 60s radicalism passed him by initially. Students wanted revolution, transformation, utopia. They read Fanon and Marcuse and Che, not measured appeals for limits and moderation. Camus seemed too cautious, too wedded to bourgeois humanism. His insistence on individual dignity, on rejecting murder even for good causes, felt quaint when the stakes appeared civilizational. The new left needed certainty. Camus offered doubt. But fashions change. 70s brought disillusionment as revolutionary movements produced new tyrannies. Cambodia's killing fields, China's cultural revolution. The Gulag testimonies that could no longer be dismissed as propaganda. The dream of purifying violence curdled. Suddenly Camus' warnings read differently. His argument in The Rebel, that revolutions devour their children and betray their principles. That means corrupt ends. That you can't build heaven through hell. It stopped sounding like timidity and started sounding like tragic wisdom. The myth of Sisyphus found new audiences through existential psychology. Therapists saw in his absurdism a framework for helping patients find meaning without religious consolation or ideological certainty. You're going to die, life is meaningless, suffering is guaranteed, now how do you live? Not despite these facts, but with them, through them. The rock rolls down, you walk back down the mountain, you push it up again. Happiness isn't the absence of struggle, but the embrace of it. Students still discovered the stranger at 18 and felt seen. That experience of going through motions, of not feeling what you're supposed to feel, of watching yourself from outside like Meursault at his mother's funeral. Adolescence is full of that dissociation. The shock of the murder, the trial's absurdity, the Kafkaesque machinery of justice concerned with appearance over reality, the execution looming. It worked as coming-of-age novel and philosophical text simultaneously. You could read it in an afternoon. It stayed with you for decades. Academic industry built around him gradually. Dissertations, conferences, scholarly editions, the usual process of canonization. His notebooks got published, revealing the private thoughts behind public works. Drafts and fragments appeared, showing how he revised, what he cut, where he struggled. The First Man manuscript, recovered from the accident site, stayed in a drawer for 34 years before his daughter agreed to publish it. When it appeared in 1994, it became a bestseller, proof his voice still mattered, that readers wanted to know how the argument would have continued. Biographies multiplied, some admiring, some critical, all trying to reconcile contradictions. The working-class Algerian who became Parisian literary celebrity, the advocate of Mediterranean sensuality who suffered depression and illness, the moralist who had affairs, the anti-communist who wouldn't condemn the Soviet Union, clearly, until late, the anti-colonialist who couldn't support Algerian independence, the writer who preached engagement but retreated to isolation. Nobody emerged with a simple story. That's usually the sign of an actual person, rather than a symbol. His friendships got documented obsessively. The Sartre split especially. Scholars picked through every letter, every published exchange, trying to determine who was right. Mostly, they concluded both were, on different points, and both were impossible. Sartre's review of The Rebel was intellectually sound but personally vicious. Camus' response was hurt and defensive, but not entirely wrong. The tragedy was that two brilliant men who needed each other couldn't overcome pride and politics. No villain, just damage. His influence spread beyond France. American writers discovered him, particularly the spare prose style, the philosophical concerns embedded in narrative, the moral seriousness without preachiness. You can trace his impact through authors as different as Paul Auster and Don DeLillo, neither of whom write like him, but both concerned with similar questions about meaning and absurdity in contemporary life. His method more than his conclusions, showing philosophy through story. Eastern European dissidents read him during Soviet domination. His anti-totalitarianism, his insistence on individual conscience against ideological systems, his defense of truth-telling, these resonated in Prague and Warsaw and Budapest, where intellectuals faced exactly the choice he described between revolutionary orthodoxy and human decency. Václav Havel cited him. Adam Michnik found in The Rebel a framework for opposing communism without embracing reaction. The Mediterranean ideal he championed quietly influenced environmentalism. Not the explicit politics, but the underlying sensibility, the love of physical world, the attention to sunlight and sea, the insistence that nature has value beyond human purposes. His descriptions of Algerian beaches of swimming and sunlight carried an ethic of appreciating the earth as it is, not worship exactly, but gratitude, recognition that we're part of something larger that doesn't need justifying through us. His theatre work got revived periodically. Caligula, especially, that meditation on power and nihilism, found new productions whenever tyrants emerged. The emperor who decides since nothing matters, he'll prove it through cruelty, who pushes logic to its murderous extreme. The play was warning about what happens when you embrace absurdity without limits, when you skip from life is meaningless to therefore everything is permitted. Camus spent his career rejecting that leap. The plays dramatized the stakes. His moral philosophy entered textbooks. The distinction between absurdism and nihilism became standard. The argument about rebellion versus revolution got taught in political theory courses. His ethics of limits, his insistence that good intentions don't justify any means, his position that some actions are absolutely wrong regardless of consequences. These challenged utilitarian orthodoxy and consequentialist thinking. He was deontological without being religious, defending human dignity without invoking God or nature or reason. Just certain things you don't do. The personal essays aged better than expected. Return to Tipasa, written after years away from Algeria, describing the physical sensation of homecoming and loss, it worked as memoir and meditation on exile. The Wind at Gemila, with its ecstatic surrender to landscape, environmentalists claimed it. Helen's Exile, connecting Greek aesthetic values to contemporary, moral poverty, classicists appreciated it. The occasional pieces weren't just footnotes, but legitimate contributions. His journalism got collected and studied. The combat editorials from Liberation, the reports on Kabylia famine, the articles on capital punishment. They showed him working in real time, applying principles to immediate crises, sometimes succeeding and sometimes not. The failures were instructive, his certainty about some issues, his blind spots about others. He was brilliant and limited, like everyone who tries to think ethically about politics. The photographs became iconic. That Cartier-Bresson portrait, Camus in overcoat, cigarette dangling, collar up, looking simultaneously tough and vulnerable, handsome in that very French intellectual way. It got reproduced on book covers, posters, dorm room walls. The image merged with the ideas, creating a figure who represented a certain kind of integrity, a style of being in the world. Probably unfair to the actual man, but symbols work that way. His influence on philosophy remained contested. Professional philosophers often dismissed him as literary, not rigorous, too accessible to be serious. The existentialists claimed him despite his protests. The absurdists made him their figurehead, though he rejected the label. Analytic philosophers ignored him entirely. Wrong tradition, wrong method, wrong concerns. Continental philosophy incorporated him selectively, valuing the ethics more than the metaphysics. He existed in disciplinary limbo, too philosophical for literature departments, too literary for philosophy departments. But students kept reading him. That's the test that matters. Not what scholars argue, but whether the books stay alive, whether new generations find them necessary. The plague still sells during epidemics, spiked massively during COVID as people sought frameworks for understanding collective suffering and individual responsibility under crisis conditions. The rebel gets rediscovered whenever revolutionary movements emerge and people need language for criticizing them from the left without embracing reaction. The Stranger remains the most assigned novel in French high schools and American college literature courses. His appeal crosses political lines in ways that confused ideologues. Conservatives appreciated his anti-communism and defense of Western values. Progressives valued his anti-colonialism and advocacy for the oppressed. Libertarians liked his individualism and suspicion of state power. Communitarians found resonance in his emphasis on solidarity and limits. Everyone could claim part of him because he refused simple positions, or maybe because his thinking evolved and contradicted itself, because he was genuinely uncertain about many things, because he prioritized honesty over consistency. The question his life and work pose hasn't been answered. How do you live ethically in a world without transcendent meaning or moral absolutes? How do you fight injustice without becoming unjust? How do you maintain hope without illusions? How do you create meaning in a meaningless universe? How do you love a world that doesn't love you back? His responses, revolt, solidarity, limits, lucidity, gratitude, aren't solutions but orientations, ways of approaching the problem rather than solving it. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all philosophy can do, not provide answers but clarify questions, not resolve dilemmas, but help you think about them more carefully. Not eliminate suffering, but suggest how to bear it with dignity. He never promised more than that. He said, imagine Sisyphus happy, not imagine Sisyphus free from the rock. He said, fight the plague knowing you'll lose, not fight the plague because you'll win. He said, rebel against injustice while respecting human life, not rebel, and everything will work out fine. The legacy is complicated by what he might have become. He died at 46, published his first novel at 29. He had 17 years of major productivity, was just entering what should have been his mature period. Writers often do their best work in their 50s and 60s. Look at Tolstoy, Mann, Eliot. Camus was still developing, still revising his positions, still working through contradictions. The first man suggests he was moving towards something more personal, more forgiving, less concerned with philosophical systems, and more with lived experience, memory, gratitude. We'll never know what that mature work would have looked like. The accident took him before he could write it. But the unfinished quality makes sense. His philosophy was always about process, not arrival, about living the questions rather than settling them. The work feels incomplete because the life was incomplete, because the thinking hadn't stopped, because he died mid-sentence, literally and philosophically. His personal life complicates the moral authority he claimed. He wrote eloquently about solidarity and justice while conducting multiple affairs, deceiving his wife repeatedly, treating women as conquests more than equals. He championed the oppressed while living comfortably in Paris literary circles, enjoying fame and status. He criticized bourgeois hypocrisy while embodying aspects of it. Does this undermine the philosophy? Some argue yes, that moral philosophy requires moral consistency, that you can't advocate ethics you don't practice. Others say personal failure doesn't invalidate intellectual insight, that flawed people can recognize important truths, that philosophy isn't autobiography. Both positions have merit. The contradiction doesn't resolve neatly. What remains undeniable is the urgency. Reading him doesn't feel like reading history. It feels present, immediate, necessary. The questions he asked are the questions we're still asking. The tensions he identified haven't disappeared. The choice between nihilism and meaning-making, between cynicism and hope, between despair and revolt, these remain live options, not settled issues. Every generation has to answer them again. Consider how his framework applies to contemporary crises. Climate change presents an absurd situation in the technical sense. We know catastrophe is coming. We know our individual actions are insufficient, yet we must act anyway. The temptation toward either denial or despair mirrors the philosophical suicide he warned against. His response would likely be, acknowledge the reality, accept the limits of individual power, act anyway through solidarity and collective effort, find meaning in the struggle itself rather than guaranteed outcomes. Political polarization creates another absurdist trap. Systems feel broken, institutions fail us, solutions seem impossible. The nihilist conclusion is that nothing matters, everything's corrupt, why bother? The fanatic conclusion is that only total revolution or my side's complete victory will fix things. His third way, recognize the brokenness, reject both nihilism and fanaticism, work for incremental justice while respecting human complexity, maintain tension between ideals and reality. It's harder than the alternatives. That's why people avoid it. Technology raises questions he couldn't have anticipated, but his thinking illuminates. Social media creates absurd conditions, infinite information producing less understanding, constant connection producing more isolation, algorithmic systems shaping choices while maintaining illusions of freedom. His emphasis on direct experience and authentic relationship offers counterweight. His warning about ideological thinking applies to algorithm-driven echo chambers. His insistence on limits challenges utopian tech promises. The pandemic revealed how relevant his work remains. The plague wasn't prophecy, but it described patterns that repeat. Denial and panic, heroism and selfishness, solidarity and division, meaning-making under crisis, continuing ordinary life amid extraordinary death, all appeared exactly as he'd depicted. Readers found the novel helpful not because it predicted COVID, but because it had thought carefully about what plague conditions do to individuals and communities, what choices they force, what responses prove meaningful. His writing on capital punishment gained new attention during recent debates. He argued that state killing is categorically different from individual murder because it's premeditated, systematic, involves entire communities in guilt. Society claims moral authority to kill while denying it to individuals, but this authority rests on no secure foundation. If murder is wrong, state murder is wrong. The argument hasn't been refuted, just ignored by those who find it inconvenient. But it's there, waiting, clear and forceful, for anyone willing to engage it seriously. The colonial question haunts differently now. His positions seem obviously wrong from contemporary perspective. Too cautious, too concerned with French interests, insufficiently supportive of liberation movements. Yet reading the journalism chronologically reveals evolution. He moved from liberal reformism toward more radical positions, was still moving when he died. The question isn't whether he reached correct conclusions, but whether his thinking process, prioritizing civilian life, rejecting collective punishment, acknowledging complexity, seeking justice without vengeance, offers anything useful. Maybe yes, maybe no. The debate continues. What he got right was the psychological dimension. He understood how meaning collapses, how people respond when foundational beliefs crumble, how difficult it is to build anything after deconstruction. The 20th century specialized in destroying certainties, religious, political, moral, epistemological. He lived through the destruction and tried to construct something afterward. Not a new certainty, but a way of living without one. That project remains unfinished, collectively and individually. His influence on literature proved more lasting than on philosophy. Writers learned from him how to handle ideas through story, how to make philosophical questions concrete and dramatic, how to explore moral dilemmas through character and situation rather than argument. The American novelists who emerged after him, Roth, DeLillo, Morrison, show his impact. The international authors who cite him, Coetzee, Pamuk, Murakami, acknowledge the debt. He demonstrated that serious fiction could engage serious ideas without becoming didactic, that novels could think. The style matters as much as the content. That stripped-down prose, those short declarative sentences, the refusal of rhetorical flourish. It created a specific effect. Clarity without simplification. Directness without brutality. Simplicity that reveals complexity rather than hiding it. Generations of writers imitated the surface features without understanding the purpose. The style wasn't aesthetic choice, but philosophical necessity. It enacted the values he advocated: honesty, precision, refusal of mystification. His Nobel lecture addressed this directly. He spoke about the writer's responsibility to truth and freedom, the obligation to serve those who suffer rather than those who rule, the necessity of bearing witness even when it's dangerous. Not propaganda for good causes, but art that illuminates human experience honestly. He knew he was describing an impossible standard. He knew writers fail it constantly, himself included. But the standard matters, the attempt matters. Failing while trying is different from not trying. The aesthetic philosophy deserves more attention than it receives. He argued beauty isn't escapism, but resistance. Creating something beautiful in an ugly world is revolt. Art that affirms life under conditions that deny it performs political work without becoming political art. The distinction is crucial. Art with agenda is propaganda. Art that simply insists on beauty, meaning, human value. That's revolutionary because it contradicts the nihilism that power requires. Tyranny needs people to believe nothing matters. Art proves something does. This explains his strange relationship with Christianity. He wasn't religious, but he valued what religion had provided: community, ritual, transcendence, meaning structures. He saw the hunger for these things in modern people, and knew secular philosophy hadn't adequately replaced them. His work tries to offer secular equivalents: solidarity for communion, revolt for salvation, lucidity for faith. Whether it works remains debatable. Many find the substitutes insufficient, but the attempt was serious, not dismissive. The friendship with Sartre's collapse still fascinates because it staged a larger conflict. Two intellectuals who'd been close, shared values and experiences, worked together during resistance, suddenly unable to talk to each other. The political disagreement was real, but underneath ran something deeper. Different temperaments, different priorities, different ways of thinking about freedom and responsibility. Sartre prioritized liberation, accepted necessary violence, trusted historical process. Camus prioritized limits, rejected means, justify ends logic, doubted progress narratives. Both positions have truth, neither is complete. The inability to hold both simultaneously, to maintain creative tension, produced rupture instead of synthesis. That failure suggests something about intellectual discourse generally. We want consistency, clear positions, sides to choose. Ambiguity frustrates us, but the most important questions don't have clean answers. Living with contradiction, maintaining multiple perspectives, resisting premature resolution. These are skills, difficult ones. His work teaches them even when his life didn't always demonstrate them. The teaching matters regardless. His relevance to contemporary ethics appears in unexpected places. Medical ethics borrowed the concept of revolt, patients asserting autonomy against paternalistic systems, rejecting passive acceptance of medical authority. Environmental ethics uses his framework for action without guarantee. We fight environmental destruction, knowing we might fail, finding meaning in the fight itself. Business ethics applies his thinking on limits. Markets need constraints. Profit maximization isn't sufficient moral framework. Human dignity sets boundaries. The educational impact is harder to measure, but probably more significant than academic influence. Millions of students encounter him in high school or college, usually through The Stranger or The Plague. For many, it's their first serious exposure to existential questions, their first encounter with philosophy through literature. Whether they remember the arguments or just the feeling, the sense that big questions matter, that literature can help you think about life, is impossible to know. But teachers keep assigning the books. That suggests they keep working. Or his vision of happiness deserves final attention. Not optimism, not denial, not escapism. Happiness as lucidity plus gratitude. Seeing clearly how things are, accepting necessity, choosing to love the world anyway. Finding joy in simple things, sunlight, swimming, friendship, work, without needing them to mean something beyond themselves. This isn't resignation, but affirmation. The difference is subtle but crucial. Resignation accepts defeat. Affirmation chooses life, knowing its limits. The famous image of Sisyphus captures this perfectly. Condemned to push a rock uphill forever, watching it roll down, pushing again eternally. The gods intended this as torture, but imagine him happy. Not because the task will end, or because the rock will stay up, or because some reward awaits. Happy because he's chosen to embrace the task, found meaning in the effort, accepted the absurd, and decided it's enough. The image works because it's honest. Life is repetitive, futile, exhausting. Things fall apart. We fix them. They fall apart again. Acknowledging this without despair is the achievement. Whether you find this persuasive depends on temperament, probably more than argument. Some people can't imagine Sisyphus happy, find the suggestion obscene or absurd in the negative sense. Others recognize their own experience in it, see it as description rather than prescription. The philosophy doesn't convince through logic alone. It resonates or doesn't based on how you experience existence, what you've lived through, what you need from ideas. His death created a myth that overwhelms the work sometimes. Dying young and violently tends to do that. James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, JFK. The myth simplifies, makes him more coherent than he was, freezes him at a moment, rather than letting the thinking develop. Fighting the myth means returning to the actual texts, reading carefully, noticing contradictions and evolution, resisting the temptation to make him into a symbol. But symbols serve purposes too. He became shorthand for certain values: integrity, resistance, humanism, Mediterranean sensibility, revolt without hatred. Whether the real person embodied these consistently matters less than whether the symbol remains useful. People invoke his name to legitimize positions he might not have held. That's unavoidable. The question is whether the invocation connects to anything real in the work or just exploits the brand. The ultimate test is practical. Does reading him change anything? Does it clarify thinking, suggest actions, provide comfort or challenge? For some people, clearly yes. They describe encountering his work at crucial moments, finding language for experiences they couldn't articulate, discovering permission to think differently. Others find him dated, limited, male, European, blind to perspectives he didn't share. Both responses are valid. Great writers aren't for everyone. What he offers those he reaches is a way of thinking about meaninglessness that doesn't end in paralysis, an ethics that doesn't require metaphysical guarantees, a politics that acknowledges tragedy without embracing it, a philosophy that starts from honesty about the human condition and builds from there. Not a solution but an approach, not answers but better questions. Whether the philosophy succeeds depends partly on what you're asking it to do. If you want systematic answers, comprehensive worldviews, detailed prescriptions for living, you'll be disappointed. He offers fragments, provocations, starting points. The value lies in what you build from them, not what he hands you complete. His influence on literature extended beyond philosophy into pure storytelling technique. That flat, transparent prose style, short sentences, simple words, minimal description, became a template. Hemingway had pioneered something similar, but his version carried more implication, more iceberg beneath surface. The Camus style is what you see. No tricks, no hidden meanings, just clarity. Novelists afterward either imitated this or deliberately rejected it, writing baroque, complex, layered prose as explicit counterstatement. Either way, they were responding to him, defining themselves in relation to his example. The question of whether he was primarily novelist or philosopher produces tedious arguments. He called himself both. The division seems artificial anyway. Sartre wrote novels and plays. Nietzsche wrote aphorisms and poetry. Kierkegaard wrote pseudonymous dialogues. Philosophy doesn't require academic prose. Sometimes narrative conveys ideas better than argument, reaches different audiences, sticks in memory more effectively. The stranger communicates something about alienation that no essay could match. Whether that makes it philosophy or literature matters only to people defending departmental boundaries. His Nobel Prize acceptance speech reveals interesting tensions. He speaks about the writer's role, the artist's responsibility, the need for literature to serve humanity. Noble sentiments, sincerely meant, but they sit oddly with his actual practice. His novels aren't didactic, don't preach, refuse to tell readers what to think. The gap between what he said writers should do and what he actually did as writer suggests someone still figuring things out, caught between competing impulses. That's more interesting than consistency would be. Finished thinkers are dead thinkers. The political misjudgments look worse with distance. Supporting French colonialism in Algeria even partially seems indefensible now. His arguments that immediate independence would cause chaos, that Europeans born there had rights too, that gradual reform was better than violent revolution, these weren't entirely unreasonable at the time, but history proved them wrong. The Algerian War became exactly the nightmare he feared, and French withdrawal happened anyway. His position satisfied nobody, angered everyone, accomplished nothing. Sometimes the middle ground is just the place you get shot from both sides. But refusing to judge historical figures by contemporary standards doesn't mean ignoring their failures either. The balance is acknowledging context while maintaining critical distance. He got this wrong. The reasons are partly personal. His mother lived in Algeria, he feared for her safety, and partly philosophical, his commitment to non-violence making him distrust revolutionary movements. Understandable doesn't mean acceptable. You can see how someone arrived at bad positions without excusing the positions themselves. His relationship with Sartre's eventual break wasn't just political. Personal resentment, jealousy, wounded pride all played roles. Sartre's philosophical output dwarfed his. The existentialist label stuck to Sartre more than him. Being and nothingness became the canonical text while his work seemed lighter, less rigorous. Whether he minded this consciously or not, the dynamic created tension. When political differences emerged, they provided excuse to sever a relationship already strained. The published exchange of letters reads like two people who'd wanted to fight for years, finally finding acceptable reason. The question of whether he was actually existentialist matters less than why he rejected the label so insistently. Partly, he disliked movements and categories generally, wanted to remain independent. Partly he disagreed with specific existentialist doctrines, particularly Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence. His philosophy emphasized limits, human nature, constants across cultures, all things existentialism supposedly denied. But mainly he resented being grouped with Sartre, treated as junior partner in someone else's movement. The rejection was personal before it was philosophical. His concept of revolt requires distinguishing from rebellion or revolution. Rebellion is reactive, driven by resentment, wants to destroy. Revolution seeks total transformation, new world built on ruins of old. Revolt accepts limits, knows perfection is impossible, aims for incremental justice while maintaining awareness of tragedy. This is conservative in some sense, skeptical of utopian projects, wary of radical change, but also radical in refusing to accept unjust conditions as inevitable. The rebel says no to oppression without claiming to have blueprint for perfect society. That combination frustrates people wanting clearer political programs. The Mediterranean sensibility he celebrated, sunshine, sea, physical pleasure, ancient wisdom, acceptance of limits, this can seem like escapism or aestheticism, retreat into private enjoyment while world burns. But he meant it as alternative to Northern European obsessions with progress, history, future, transformation, suggesting that happiness might be found in present moment, in body and landscape, and simple human connection. This was philosophical position, not just personal preference. Whether it's adequate response to injustice and suffering is fair question. Sometimes wine and swimming aren't enough. His essays on art, particularly the pieces about Greek tragedy, classical architecture, Mediterranean light, these reveal someone thinking through beauty's relationship to truth. Beauty isn't decoration or escape, but revelation, way of seeing clearly, antidote to abstraction. This connects to his political ethics. Abstractions, nation, history, future, ideology, these enable violence because they're bloodless, don't register human cost. Beauty returns attention to particular, immediate, embodied. You can't massacre people you actually see, whose faces and voices and individuality register as real. Abstraction makes killing possible. Beauty resists it. Whether this is naive depends on your view of human nature. History suggests people can in fact kill those they see clearly, that beauty doesn't reliably prevent atrocity. But maybe the point isn't empirical claim about beauty's effectiveness, but ethical claim about necessary stance. We should attend to beauty, and particular and immediate, not because it guarantees good outcomes, but because it's the right way to approach existence. Effectiveness and rightness aren't the same thing. His writing about nature, the sun especially, also sea and desert, reads almost religious sometimes. Not religious in conventional sense, no deity or transcendence, but treating natural world as source of meaning and value. This fits with his paganism, his love of ancient Greeks who saw gods in landscape. Modern, secular people often lose this, treat nature as backdrop or resource. Recovering sense of nature as meaningful presence, worthy of attention and reverence in itself, this was part of his philosophical project. Whether successful or just nostalgic is open question. The problem of suicide gets treated seriously in the myth of Sisyphus, but the analysis is strange. He claims suicide is the only serious philosophical question, whether life is worth living, then spends book arguing against it. The argument basically says, life is absurd, suicide would be giving in to absurdity, therefore we should live in revolt against absurdity. But this only works if you already value revolt, already think giving in is worse than enduring. Someone genuinely considering suicide wouldn't find this persuasive. It's argument for people who've already decided to live, giving them philosophical justification for choice they've made. That's not worthless, but it's not what the opening promises either. His depictions of women in the novels are problematic by contemporary standards, though not worse than most male writers of his era. Women exist largely in relation to male protagonists, defined by sexual availability or maternal qualities, given less interiority. Marie in The Stranger is particularly thin, happy girl who likes sex and swimming, no complexity beyond that. Whether this reflects his actual views about women or just conventions of the time is debatable. Probably both. His personal relationships with women were apparently more complex than his fictional portrayals suggest. The gap between lived experience and literary representation indicates something worth examining. The concept of limits appears constantly throughout his work. Limits of knowledge, action, justice, happiness. Human nature has limits. Politics must respect limits. Revolt recognizes limits. This distinguishes him from both optimistic progressives who believe unlimited improvement is possible and pessimistic reactionaries who think nothing can improve. His position, significant improvement, is possible within permanent constraints. We can make things better without making them perfect. Accepting this avoids both naive hope and cynical despair. Whether the position satisfies depends on whether you can live with permanent tension between aspiration and limit. His influence on post-war French thought was substantial, even where people disagreed with him. The generation following, Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, they rejected his humanism, his faith in reason, his belief in universal human nature, but they were reacting against him, defining themselves in opposition, which means he'd set the terms. You can't escape influence by rejection. The arguments he framed continued even after his positions were abandoned. His death's timing was almost too perfect, dying at 46, at height of fame, before decline or compromise, before late work that might disappoint. Dying randomly, absurdly, in car crash. The circumstances fit his philosophy so well, they seem invented, but they weren't. Sometimes reality cooperates with symbolism. The myth this created, tragic hero, cut down in prime, it's not entirely false, but it's not entirely true either. Real person was more complicated, contradictory, unfinished than myth allows. Reading him now means reading across considerable distance, cultural, temporal, political. The Cold War context that shaped his positions has vanished. Colonial questions he struggled with have different forms now. The existential mood of post-war Europe seems remote. But certain themes remain current: meaninglessness, violence, justice, happiness, how to live without guarantees. These don't age. Every generation faces them new. The question of whether his work will last another 50 years is unanswerable, but interesting. Literary reputation is unpredictable. Writers considered major in their time vanish. Minor figures get rediscovered. Current academic fashion tends against him. Too humanist, too universalist, too male, too European. But academic fashion isn't final judgment. Readers keep finding him useful. Students keep encountering him. The stranger keeps selling. That suggests something durable, though what exactly is hard to specify. His contribution might be less specific doctrines than general attitude. Facing reality without illusions, but also without despair. Maintaining ethical commitment without metaphysical foundation. Finding meaning in action and relationship rather than abstract belief. Accepting tragedy without becoming tragic. These aren't unique to him, but he articulated them clearly, made them available to people needing that particular combination. That's what philosophy does at its best. Not solving problems, but clarifying options, showing what certain choices entail, making positions available. The final assessment probably shouldn't aim for final assessment. He was writer and thinker who produced work some people find valuable for specific purposes at specific moments. Not for everyone, not for all time, not the answer to everything. Just one voice among many, saying certain things clearly that needed saying, helping some readers think through problems they faced. That's enough. Asking more means asking for what philosophy can't deliver. His legacy is the work itself ultimately. Not the biography, not the myth, not what people say about him. The novels and essays and plays, whether they still speak to readers, whether they clarify or challenge or console, whether they help people think and live. That's the only measure that matters. Everything else is commentary. The absurd remains the best entry point. Start there, with the gap between human need for meaning and universe's silence, and everything else follows. His entire project was finding ways to live in that gap without either denying it or being crushed by it. Whether he succeeded, you'll have to decide yourself. The philosophy offers no proofs, only suggestions. Take what's useful, leave the rest, think for yourself. That's what he would have wanted, probably. The manuscripts scattered across his desk that January morning would never be finished. Letters to friends half written. Notes for lectures he'd agreed to give. The novel sitting at page 144, mid-thought, the handwriting getting looser as ideas outpaced his ability to capture them. All of it abandoned not through choice but interruption. That's what death does. It doesn't wait for convenient stopping points. His mother couldn't read the obituaries. She heard people talking, understood something terrible had happened, but the specifics eluded her. Deaf, nearly mute, she'd outlived her husband by 46 years, and now her son too. The randomness must have been incomprehensible. He'd survived tuberculosis, war, poverty, occupation, then a car on a wet road erased him. No narrative logic, just physics and bad luck. Paris buried him with the honours he'd spent years trying to escape. Government officials attended. Speeches were delivered about loss to French letters, to moral philosophy, to the nation. None of it would have pleased him much. He'd wanted to write in L'Ormera, away from ceremonies and official recognition, away from being Albert Camus, the public intellectual. Just write. Figure out what he actually thought about his childhood, his mother, the sun on Algerian beaches. The first man was supposed to be that reckoning. We got fragments instead, which is appropriate somehow. His philosophy never promised completion, never suggested you'd arrive at final answers. The process was the point. Thinking clearly, living honestly, pushing the boulder up, knowing it rolls back down. He didn't finish the argument because the argument can't be finished. Each person has to work it through themselves. The readership split immediately into factions. Some claimed he'd been moving toward political conservatism. Others insisted he was radicalizing. Some read the late work as retreat into aestheticism. Others as maturation beyond youthful certainty. Everyone found the Camus they needed. That's what happens when a writer dies mid-career. The trajectory gets frozen, the destination unknown, so people project their preferred endings. What actually remained was simpler than the mythology, a collection of books, some very good, some less so, ideas about absurdity and revolt, and limits that some readers found useful. A prose style that influenced how subsequent writers constructed sentences. A life lived imperfectly while advocating for perfection, which is just the human condition described accurately. His children grew up with the weight of that name. Being Camus's son or daughter meant carrying expectations they'd never agreed to, comparisons they couldn't win. They chose privacy, avoided public life, refused to become guardians of the legacy. Smart choice. Let the work speak for itself. Let readers decide what matters without the family providing authorized interpretation. The Academy eventually absorbed him, as it absorbs everyone who lasts. Dissertations multiplied. Conferences were held. Scholarly editions appeared with annotations explaining references, providing context, mapping influences. Useful work, necessary work, but also work that risks making the writing feel like historical artifact rather than living thought. The trick is reading past the scholarship, encountering the actual voice. That voice still carries. The opening of The Stranger still hits like it did in 1942. The image of Sisyphus still clarifies something about existence that abstract philosophy misses. The Plague Doctor still models how to act ethically without guarantees. These things work not because they're perfect or complete, but because they're honest. They describe experiences we recognize even when we lack language for them. Whether his answers satisfy is almost beside the point. The questions matter more. How do you live when nothing has inherent meaning? How do you act ethically without absolute moral laws? How do you fight injustice without becoming unjust? How do you find happiness in a tragic world? These aren't problems you solve once and move on. They're permanent conditions requiring constant negotiation. His temperament shaped the philosophy as much as the arguments did. Someone else with the same premises might have concluded differently. The Mediterranean sensibility, the love of physical pleasure, the memories of childhood poverty, the tuberculosis, the war, the complicated relationship with Algeria, all of it fed into how he thought. Philosophy isn't pure reason. It's embodied thinking, shaped by biography and culture and personality. His particular combination produced his particular vision. The contradictions never resolved, the moralist who had affairs, the anti-colonialist who couldn't support independence, the advocate of limits who sometimes ignored them, the systematic thinker whose work resisted systematization. You can view these as failures or as honest reflections of human complexity. Probably both. We contain multitudes, some of them contradict each other. His relevance cycles, periods when he seems dated, too tied to post-war European concerns. Then crises emerge that make him current again. Pandemic brings renewed interest in the plague. Political polarization sends people back to the rebel. Each generation discovers him differently, takes what it needs, ignores the rest. That's how classics work. They're not universally relevant, but repeatedly relevant to specific concerns. The Nobel Prize looked like culmination, but was really interruption. He'd just started exploring new territory, moving beyond the philosophy of the absurd towards something else. What that something would have been, we'll never know. The trajectory was broken. We got the beginning and middle of the argument, not the conclusion. Maybe that's fitting. Maybe conclusions are overrated. What he left was permission. Permission to acknowledge meaninglessness without surrendering to nihilism. Permission to fight for justice without claiming absolute certainty. Permission to love the world despite its indifference. Permission to find happiness in simple things. Sunlight, swimming, friendship, without needing them to mean something beyond themselves. Not everyone needs that permission. For those who do, his work remains available. The question isn't whether he was right. The question is whether engaging with his thought helps you think more clearly about your own life. Does it clarify anything? Challenge anything? Suggest possibilities you hadn't considered? If yes, then it's useful. If no, then read someone else. Philosophy isn't religion. You don't have to accept the whole system or reject it completely. Take what works. His grave in Lourmarin stays simple. No monument, no grand inscription. Just a stone with his name and dates. People visit, leave flowers, take photos. The pilgrimage site phenomenon he would have found embarrassing. But symbols serve purposes beyond the person's wishes. He represents something for people who need that representation. Fighting that would be futile. The manuscripts recovered from the accident site, blood-stained, crumpled, but readable, they got preserved in archives. Scholars study them, track revisions, analyse what he was attempting. But the unfinished quality is the message. Life interrupts, work remains incomplete, plans go unrealised. That's not tragedy, that's just what happens. Making peace with incompletion is part of accepting absurdity. 64 years have passed since the crash. Everyone who knew him personally is dead now. The direct memory has vanished. What remains is mediated through text, through scholarship, through mythology. That's all any writer gets eventually. The work either survives on its own terms or it doesn't. His has. Whether it continues another 60 years depends on whether future readers find it speaks to their concerns. The final image should be Sisyphus, not the tortured figure the gods intended, but the one Camus imagined, walking back down the mountain after the boulder has rolled down again, fully conscious of what awaits, choosing to push it up anyway, finding something like happiness in that choice, not because the task will end or because the rock will stay up, or because some reward awaits, just because the alternative, giving up, lying down, accepting defeat, that's not living. Whether you can imagine Sisyphus happy determines whether the philosophy works for you. Some people can't. They find the suggestion absurd in the negative sense, a trick with words that doesn't correspond to real experience. Others recognize themselves in the image, see their own lives in the endless repetition, the meaningless task, the choice to continue anyway. The resonance or its absence is the test. He gave us that image and a handful of others. The stranger who won't perform expected emotions. The plague doctor who fights knowing he'll lose. The rebel who says no without claiming to have all answers. The man who loves sunlight and sea despite knowing death is coming. Take them or leave them. They're available. That's all any writer can do. Make something, put it out there, hope it finds the people who need it. The work sits on shelves now, spine out, waiting. Some copies pristine, never opened. Others marked up, underlined, passages memorized. Both conditions are fine. Books exist to be used or not used according to need. His particular combination of honesty and hope, darkness and beauty, philosophy and story, it serves some readers and not others. That's how it should be. What he understood was that you can acknowledge life's meaninglessness and still choose life. That rebellion against absurdity doesn't require belief in ultimate victory. That solidarity with other people matters even when nothing cosmic justifies it. That beauty exists and deserves attention even in tragic circumstances. That limits are real and ignoring them leads to horror. That happiness is possible without illusions. These aren't solutions, they're stances, ways of orienting yourself toward existence when easy answers aren't available. The boulder is at the bottom of the mountain again. It's always at the bottom of the mountain. The question is whether you walk back down to push it up again. His answer was yes. Not because pushing it is meaningful in some ultimate sense, because that's what living is. The task itself, the effort, the consciousness of what you're doing while you're doing it, and somehow impossibly finding that enough. That's where we leave him. Not with final answers or complete systems or resolved contradictions, just with the work, the questions, the images that stick. Whether they help you think about how to live is between you and the text. He's not here to explain or defend or clarify, just the words he left behind, arranged in the order he chose, saying what they say. Read them or don't. Take what's useful. Think for yourself. Push the boulder. Imagine yourself happy. That's the whole argument. Everything else is commentary.